Welcome, everyone. I'm Maxie Jane Frazier, and along with my creative partner, Catherine Parnell, we make up Birch Bark Editing. We're so delighted you're joining us tonight for this In Conversation event with Lauren K. Johnson and Matt Gallagher. A couple of Birch Bark details first, and then we'll lead on to the event. If you'll keep an eye on the chat, there's going to be links to Birch Bark things and to the authors' things in the chat. We run a flash fiction, poetry, nonfiction journal called Microlit Almanac, and we hope you'll check that out. Thursdays, we have new material coming out. We also have a workshop called Kaleidoscope, where we work on flash fiction, and it builds a writing community, and it's a chance to get some great new readings and prompts. You can check that out at the link in the chat as well. You can look for the event recording and future events at our own website. And then if you like these events and you want to support us, if you want to just buy us a cup of coffee, we do have a donation link if you're interested. But now on to the reason we're here tonight. I will introduce Lauren and Matt to you and then let them take things away. Lauren K. Johnson is a former military public affairs officer and Afghanistan veteran. Her memoir, The Fine Art of Camouflage, chronicles her coming of age against the backdrop of war, beginning with her mother's Army career and deployment in support of Operation Desert Storm when Lauren was 7 years old, and later with her own service. Lauren's essays, fiction, and poetry have appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Glamour, Yale Medicine Magazine, Consequence Magazine, Drunken Boat, Pleiades, and several anthologies. Her writing and interviews have been used in the creation of dance and theater productions across the country, including the Association of Writers and Writing Programs National Conference, the Boston Book Festival, and the University of Iowa. She is a writing consultant with Grub Street, an editor at the Rathbang Tree, and a former editor-in-chief of Redivider. Lauren lives with her husband and twin daughters outside Seattle. By day, she is a program director at Ignite Worldwide, a nonprofit that aims to combat the gender imbalance in STEM fields. By night, she writes with the help of her fat tabby cat and eats copious amounts of ice cream. You can find links to Lauren's website and to purchase The Fine Art of Camouflage in the chat. Matt Gallagher is the author of the novels Empire City, Young Blood, and was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Daybreak, his latest novel, is due out next year with Atria. You can find the link for Matt's website and a link to pre-order Daybreak in the chat. And now I'll hand things over to you, Matt.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here this evening and joining Lauren and me. We're going to begin before we transition to our conversation about the writing life and some other things. We're both going to be reading from our books, real kind of short appetizers, if you will. I'm going to get us started, and I'll be reading from Daybreak, which was mentioned in Max's intro there. I also want to thank Max and Kat and Birch Bark for hosting us this evening. It's really wonderful community, and excited to participate in this. Daybreak is a novel set in February 2022 in current events, just as Russia's invasion of Ukraine gets going, and it follows a pair of American military veterans who are going overseas to join the effort in supporting Ukraine. One's going to be a fighter with the International Legion, and the other is tracking down a former love that he hasn't been able to shake. So I'll be reading straight from chapter 1, so no more throat clearing necessary. And once again, this is from chapter 1 of Daybreak, due out next February. The bus pitched east through midnight black, and Pax sat with his head against the window, alone with his thoughts. Winter clawed at him through the glass, but he kept himself nestled against it. He felt the tinges of outside cold bracing and wanted to keep awake. He wet his throat and stared out at the flurries of snow dusting the road. Dark, baleful forest lay beyond. A convoy of supply Humvees crested a small hill, pushing the other way toward the border. Something sharp and hot swelled in Pax's chest. Haven't felt like this in a long time, he thought. It was thrill. It was fear. More than anything, Pax felt like someone again. They'd crossed an hour before. First had come potholes, then bunkers and checkpoints with barrels of fire licking the night. The checkpoints were for show, performative, barely better than nothing, and maybe not even that. Men with flashlights and slung hunting rifles, a gesture at presence for the sake of itself. What they need, Pax thought, is razor wire, some HESCO barriers staggered to force vehicles into a funnel, a machine gun on overwatch, ready to snuff out any runaways or squirters. The basics. They'll learn, he thought. It's all new here. The bus slowed over an old bridge, reaching a village. Brittle Ukrainian sounded through a loudspeaker, reminding of the national blackout. At a bend, a tiny church glowed dim, a mural of Jesus holding a candle charting through the snow. Pax blinked and blinked, but the image stayed with him long after they left. He hadn't believed for many years, but still wanted to be a person who could. Across the aisle, Lee was draped over his assault pack, snoring away with the clean conscience of a man who knows his place in the world. Pax had dressed to blend in, jeans, a simple black jacket. Not Lee. Lee wore a hoodie with a skull superimposed in front of crossed rifles, the word infidel screaming above the logo. He'd raised the sleeves to his elbows to show off his tattoos of flames and razor wire and old unit crests. A name tape and subdued American flag patched across his assault pack, completing the look. When Pax had teased him about it at the airport, Lee had dug in. I'll be the only Asian around for a fucking 1,000 miles. People need to know they're dealing with a killer. He wasn't, though. That was the whole thing. Lee's kill had eluded him through all his deployments, always seconds late to the firefight, a hesitant lieutenant at his shoulder, or a vexing, oblivious civilian standing between him and his chosen glory. It was just luck, happenstance, like so much else in combat, but Lee hadn't been able to shake the sense of lost purpose in the homeland. So now he was here, to again carry the gun. We gotta be there, man, Lee had said when he reached out over the phone, trying to find a travel partner as crazy or bored as he was. They need people like us. They? Us? Open questions. Paxton said yes, since no one else would. He'd heard it in Lee's voice, something between despair and disgust. And because he'd had no reply for Lee's next line, delivered with all the subtlety of an axe pick. What else you got going on? Pax had another reason for coming too, one all his own, one that had little to do with this strange new war. He guarded the secret, protected it, had it buried deep in a notebook in the backpack between his feet. It had been given to him 10 years before, and he'd held on to it ever since. A lifetime ago, he thought, when I'd been worthy of it, when I'd been worthy of her. The feeling in his chest swelled again. He tried to keep it there. It faded away. From the rear of the bus, laughter crackled like burning wood. It was followed by amused hushes, which in turn yielded more laughter. Pax knew its source, young Ukrainian men returning from abroad to join the fight. Lee had chatted up the ones who knew English while they'd driven through the outskirts of Krakow and learned they were a collection of students and IT workers living in the Nordic states. None had a day of military training. The leader, a tall blonde kid with high cheekbones, hadn't liked when Pax interjected to ask what they thought they could contribute. This is our country, was all he'd said. He'd said it coiled with hostility. Pax hadn't meant anything with his question. He just wanted to know. He turned and looked at the group. They were sharing a flask, all cultish energy and banter, trying to conceal whatever was going on inside of them with noise, which is what young people facing the prospect of battle must do. It was the way of things. This was not the time for much thinking. I'm walking proof, Pax thought, smirking. I knew just when to turn off my brain and ignore that I'm washed up and broken. Pax was 33. He'd been out of the army for more than a half decade. He didn't actually believe he was washed up. He was less sure about the broken part. His snoring friend was 39 and had quit a job as shift supervisor at a regional electronics retailer in Southern California to come here. They weren't near as close to Corporal Luke Paxton and Staff Sergeant Han Lee of the 173rd Airborne U.S. Army Infantry as they needed to pretend they were to get this far, to be on this bus, rumbling into an alien unknown. Stopping to consider that, or anything at all, would have paralyzed them. Pax took a slow yoga breath and rubbed at the prayer beads wrapped around his wrist. A lady at the VA had suggested these habits to him once upon a time, and they worked, not always, but enough. His attention pushed out the window again, but there was nothing there for him now, only the void of passing night. Sleep, drink, watch the dark. These are the options. Pax followed the rasping words across the aisle. 2 rows in front of Lee's slumbering form, a woman leaned over the back of her seat, elbows out, angled toward him. She wore an olive puffer jacket and had pulled her mousy brown hair back in a ponytail, a wave of stress lines running the horizon of her forehead. A shining blue eye, the shade of a robin's egg, severed the space between. Under the dim lighting of the bus, he could just make out the drooping eyelid that fell over its twin. Pax had taken stock of her earlier. She'd been, and remained, the only woman on the bus. And talk, Pax said, sliding over to the aisle seat of his row. That's another option. American, the woman said. Most of your people are going the other way. Pax smiled. Doing something different pleased him. For what are we born if not to aid one another, he said, repeating a line Lee had posted to Facebook that had earned many likes. In contrast to the young men, the woman's English was precise, confident. She'd lived in Ohio for a year, she explained, during her studies. Between that divide and a mention of children, Pax allowed himself to relax into the conversation. She's not beautiful, he thought, watching her good eyes shine. Not that he could judge much on the matter. He knew he wasn't handsome. Time had given him the face he deserved. Where are your kids now? He asked. They will stay in Poland with my sister until the war's over. The woman sighed and then corrected herself. Until the victory. Why? Pax hesitated. It was a tricky question, he knew. But martial law demanded only Ukrainian men stay in country. I mean, if you're okay sharing. I'm just a guy on a bus. It's my duty, she said. I'm a military officer. Of course, Pax said, hoping he'd masked his surprise, knowing he hadn't. He asked what type. NATO countries call it civil affairs. I'll be back east in a couple days. My commander gave me leave to escort my sons to the border. We live near Kyiv, and we knew they'd strike there. They need the river. She trailed off. Pax asked the name of her hometown. A place called Bucha, she said. Nothing special. Just a quiet suburb. I was in the army too, he said. She nodded as if she'd known that all along. Can I ask why you joined? She laughed. It was the ironic laughter of reluctant soldiers everywhere. To change the world, she said. Then her voice turned sincere. It was Maidan. It was the only important thing which happened to us. It showed ordinary people can fight the big strong men and win. I was too young for the barricades, but my brothers and their friends went. They were my heroes. When they came home to rest, I'd pour them tea and sneak them my father's beers and listen to what they'd done and seen that day. Their table stories were like magic. She shrugged through the dark of the bus. Besides, my father swears we're descended from Cossacks. Probably not true, but families need their little lies. Maidan, strong men, Cossacks. Pax was familiar with these things in a hazy, malleable way, but didn't want to betray the vastness of his ignorance. None of it was why he'd come. The officer saved him from any of that by returning his question. Why had he once enlisted? Wish I could remember. Fuck, he said. Then, apologies, because he'd been trying to curse less. His boss at AutoZone had told him it was unprofessional, low class, that the real world wasn't like the army. And while Pax had resented him for it, the criticism lingered. The Ukrainian didn't seem to mind, at least. She didn't even blink. It wasn't patriotism or anything, he continued, rubbing the stubble around his chin. More like a way to do something. I grew up in a small town, middle of nowhere. Biggest, nicest buildings were the Methodist Church and the National Guard Armory. He paused, remembering. Still think about that sometimes. And why are you here? Something seemed to curdle in the recycled air of the bus, and the woman's good eye fixed on him like a shaft of light. There was a directness to her rasping voice now, a sense of inquiry that was beyond the scope of conversation. Should I say that I'm looking for someone? No, he decided. Even through his duloxetine, Pax heard silent bells of caution. Wish I could remember that too, was all he said. I'll stop there. Thank you. And up next, we have Lauren and the Fine Art of Camouflage.
Thanks, Matt. I'm so excited for that book. And I have to say, so Matt and I have known each other for a long time now, and I still get a little starstruck around him because he's just so freaking awesome and prolific and just really, really nice. I've got my little shrine to Matt Gallagher here on my desk, and just wanted to share, yay, your small shrine to Lauren Johnson. This feels kind of like a full circle moment for me because Matt's memoir, Kaboom, was the first post 9/11 veteran memoir that I read when I got back from Afghanistan in 2010. And I had the opportunity to work on the publicity for Fire and Forget, which is a wonderful anthology of short fiction by Iraq and Afghanistan veterans and an amazing military spouse, Siobhan Fallon. And then met Matt at an event for Fire and Forget, and he just is a super nice guy, as I'm sure everyone here knows, even if you just joined for this event, and has been a mentor to me throughout this process, a long process of writing and publishing my own book. So really glad that technology enables us to come together for an event today, and thanks to Max and Kat for making this happen as well. So I'm going to read, also do something a little wild and read from the very start of my book, from a chapter called Combat Barbie, set in May 2009. I lay flat on my stomach behind a grassy mound. The grass was wet with dew. Water seeped through my military uniform at the knees, thighs, and elbows. My body armor pressed hard against my chest. I sucked in a deep breath of thick Indiana air, winded from my sprint across the field, and felt the Kevlar shell constrict. I winced. My boobs hurt. The armor was designed for men and for obvious reasons didn't fit perfectly. My pulse thumped beneath the helmet. I slid my rifle into prone firing position in front of me. It slapped against the ground in protest. I'd been issued 2 weapons a month earlier at the start of this military pre-deployment training, to instant dislike. The clunky M4 carbine rifle strung across my chest rattled with every step. My hands didn't seem big enough to hold it properly. I barely passed the weapons qualification, firing erratically at the green figures that popped up in my lane at the shooting range, the rifle's kick beating a bruise into my shoulder. The M9 pistol was less invasive, slipping smoothly into the holster around my right thigh, and I was somewhat familiar with its quirks. As an Air Force officer, I had an annual M9 training requirement. Before I left my Air Force base in Florida for this training in Indiana, I'd qualified as an expert marksman. But that title was deceptive. A public affairs officer, I mostly served behind a desk. My weapons were command messages and strategic communication. I fought battles in press releases, phone calls with angry local citizens, and arguments in the commander's briefing room. I was used to clearing email inboxes, not clearing weapons. Even once in Afghanistan, I would be a non-combat soldier. I shouldn't need to rely on a firearm to keep me alive, but I had to be prepared, just in case. So throughout my 3 months in Indiana, I carried my 2 weapons everywhere, even to the bathroom. On several occasions, I nearly left my M9 in a porta potty after detaching the thigh holster to pee. To foster a more amicable relationship, I named my weapons. My M4 became Annie after Annie Get Your Gun, and my M9 was Janie, in homage to Aerosmith. During the training exercise, behind the grassy mound, Annie grunted into place in front of me, and Janie dug into my thigh, and I cursed them both. I cursed myself for not being more comfortable 6 weeks into training, I cursed myself for being a spoiled Air Force desk job chick who should never have volunteered to go to war. Then I told my inner critic to shut up. A young Army corporal skidded in beside me, breathing hard. He positioned his rifle to provide cover fire. I glanced forward to the next mound, where the 2 other soldiers assigned to my tactical team waited. One of them leapt up, my cue to follow, and began running to the outer wall of the makeshift village. I tried to mimic his nimble bound from behind my own knoll, but every joint protested. I lumbered forward with the grace of an arthritic buffalo, fumbling Annie to 45 degrees at the ready, and sprinted, or attempted to sprint, to the next knoll. I wasn't out of shape. A 25-year-old competitive swimmer turned triathlete, I even completed a marathon a few months prior. But here, sludge caked to the bottom of my combat boots, I thumped half my body weight in armor and supplies. My arms pumped awkwardly around the first aid kit and extra ammo magazines fastened to the side of my bulletproof vest. I knew my deployed experience should more closely resemble the classroom portions of training. We sat through hours-long PowerPoint presentations on Afghan culture, politics, and tribal dynamics, waded through military doctrine, and held think tanks on campaign planning. Ours was a nation-building unit. As the counterinsurgency slogan went, a war for hearts and minds. It was the stuff of Greg Mortenson's 3 Cups of Tea, the best-selling 2007 memoir about an American mountaineer building schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was practically required reading for military personnel assigned to these missions. I'd read Mortenson's account and fallen head over steel-toed boots for the softer side of war, the help them help themselves, shake hands, kiss babies, sing kumbaya, and change the world kind of battle. While Special Forces soldiers were clearing villages of enemy insurgents, my unit would be 1 town over, drinking tea in the tribal leader's living room. Still, we had to be ready to fight. Crouching behind the second grassy mound in Indiana, I didn't feel ready. My next move would take me to the back side of one of the buildings. The plywood village looked bigger, more intimidating from here, more real. The corporal aligned his weapon for cover fire and whispered, "Ready, Lieutenant." I took off rattling toward the building and skidded into a crouch at the base of the wall. I paused to suck in a gulp of humid air and then inched forward, rifle poised at my shoulder, until I was next to the petite Sergeant Maria Rivera and another soldier assigned to my tactical team. When the corporal fell in beside me, we were ready to advance. We crept toward the village entrance. Other 4-person teams were already inside. I could hear barked commands and the shuffle of gravel underfoot. Doors banged open. Men yelled in English and Pashto. "Stop! Wadarega!" We rounded the corner, moving quickly now, rifles angled down in case our fingers jumped at the sight of our own soldiers. Activity strangled the narrow walkway. Camouflaged bodies darted swiftly and confidently between buildings and around actors dressed in baggy blouses and bright scarves, simulating Afghan civilians. We stopped at one of the buildings and slid along the wall until we approached the door. The soldier in front ran his hand over the frame, checking for wires or booby traps. We listened for movement inside. All I heard were commands and crunching gravel, my heartbeat and heavy breathing. "Ready?" the first soldier asked. "Ready," we all responded. He backed up, took a step, and rammed his foot into the door. It flung open, and the rest of us ran in ahead of him, each moving to a different corner of the room. Empty. I was surprised at my disappointment. "Clear," someone yelled. "Let's move out." I spun around and fell back in line outside the door. I was now in position 2, behind Sergeant Rivera. I would be first to enter the next building. Sergeant Rivera led us along the outer wall, ducking under a window cut out of the plywood. She stopped at the door and traced her hand over the frame and then nodded at me. "Ready?" "Ready." She kicked open the door. I didn't think twice about charging in. Because this was training and I knew I was safe, or because training and adrenaline took over, I don't know. But I lunged inside, rifle aimed at the back right corner. I heard the door slam into the wall, and then a loud pop, like a gunshot. A blast of air hit my right side. I fell to my knees, stunned. "You're dead," a voice said. "Just lie down." And I will stop there.
Bravo. I'm really glad you read right from the beginning there, Lauren, because I think it gives folks a real taste of your strong voice that carries throughout this fantastic memoir, and kind of scope of the various themes and ideas that you touch upon. I'd like to start the questions, if that's okay. You started writing what would become The Fine Art of Camouflage some years ago, as you kind of mentioned already. It's been out for about 4 months now. Is that right?
Yep.
How has the book changed as you wrote, revised, and developed it? How's your relationship changed to your own work and your own story since it's come out and become kind of a public facing thing? You're an official published author now. So what's that been like?
Officially official published author, which is a weird thing. It's like exciting and hard won, and like anticlimactic at the same time. I had someone who I did a reading with a couple months back say to me, "You're in the calm before the calm." And I thought that was a great description of it, because this isn't the kind of book where it's going to be on Oprah's reading list, and I'm not Prince Harry. I don't have 85,000 Amazon reviews. So my life hasn't changed dramatically, but it feels really good to have it out in the world, because it did, it's been 12 years in the making. And that is an interesting thing to think about, how much I, as a writer and just as a person, have evolved over the last 12 years. And I got my master's in fine arts and creative writing in that time, and what became this book started out as my thesis in that program. I think a great way to illustrate kind of how it's evolved is the fact that I've had 3 different epilogues. And the nature of writing a memoir is that, where does your story end? And at some point, you have to conclude that chapter. And for me, it actually kind of the stars aligned. And I mean, in a really weird and kind of morbid way, I gave birth to my twin daughters 2 months before the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. So that moment for me felt like a very, very powerful opportunity to reflect back on not just my service, but thinking about my mother's service through a new lens. My mother served in the first Gulf War, as you heard in my introduction, and I was 7 years old at the time. I had 2 siblings as well who experienced that in different ways. So thinking about what it means as a parent to try to protect our children, and the types of stories that we share with them. And given that my job was focused on storytelling and the flow of information, I started thinking about, what am I going to tell my kids about my military experience and this in a lot of ways tragic ending to this war, and what does my time there mean, and how am I going to share not just the good but also the bad and the pretty ugly with my kids someday.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Hard to imagine a 20-year war having a clean ending, but it you're a parent now, so that timeline makes sense. It's really I think this book is really kind of your education and journey as a young woman and a military officer, so that makes a ton of sense to me.
Thanks, Matt. That's a great question. And I'm actually going to kind of ask you a similar one. So similar, but also very different, because you are now preparing for your 4th book to come out, and you've been at it for a while, although a short amount of time to have your 4th book.
Not too long. Let's not age ourselves too much.
Matt looks great for his age, by the way. But no, seriously, if I get to a point where I'm publishing my 4th book, if I continue at this pace, that'll be in about 36 years. So you're doing amazingly well. But thinking about your own writing journey, and as you've evolved as a writer and as a human, and particularly as you've dabbled in different genres, how has your writing changed and your writing process changed?
So yeah, my first book was a memoir. I was a very kind of, it was told in first person, of course, naturally, but I was still kind of a character, and it was about what my scout platoon and I did and saw and thought and argued about. And not consciously, but I think maybe just kind of the natural process of getting older as a person, maybe hopefully getting better as a writer and as a thinker. I become kind of less interested in what I think and observe and participate in, and just really interested in kind of other people's experiences. Pax, the character that Daybreak largely follows, is kind of loosely based on some folks I encountered in Ukraine in that same time, but that were going over and kind of had some aimless, messy reasons for why they were going over. Right. I went over initially as just kind of a 3-week volunteer because a friend had a project that I could pitch in on. And I was really fascinated at the wide range of internationals that were arriving at that time. Some with very good purposes and very clear missions, some there to make some quick, easy money. Others, decent people, but just kind of showing up and hoping for something to kind of land in their lap. Right. There were all kinds. And I think you still finding that over there. And, war is just this big, heavy subject. And, I have books in mind that I want to write that don't touch upon the subject at all. I've written stories that don't touch upon the subject at all. But, with my books, there's something about kind of finding all these different angles at it and all these different people that keep me coming back to it. And I don't know. I think a lot of these is kind of similar to you, honestly, with Afghanistan ending. I was an Iraq veteran, so in a way, my war has been over for many years. But the way my country carries out war hasn't really changed too much. Then something like Ukraine comes along, and maybe some of my preconceived notions about armed conflict are kind of flipped on its head, right? Because here are people fighting for freedom and sovereignty in as just a way as possible, right? And that caused me to reevaluate some things, and wanted to kind of go see what other people thought about it. So I guess this is kind of a long-winded way of saying this stuff still keeps me up at night. So I might as well use my work, both fiction and nonfiction, to figure out why. Hopefully there was an answer somewhere there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that you hit it on the head there at the end, the figuring out why. Like, in order to sustain a book length project, or even, a fully complete essay or short story, I think you have to be obsessed with something, and you have to be in search of something. And sometimes we start out not knowing what that is, but ultimately we end up with I have to find the answer to this question, and it often is a why. It certainly was for me writing this book, and then the why became otherwise and took me in different directions I wasn't anticipating, which is kind of a fascinating part of the journey in and of itself.
I think that's spot on. Yeah, you better be obsessed with something if you're willing to put in the grinding work necessary at your computer every morning, or most every morning, or most every night, whenever it is you write, and be alone with your darkest thoughts.
Wow, do you do that every morning? Because that's probably why you're much more prolific than I am.
Not every morning. I try to be pretty good about it, but every morning, if you get too, I found if you get too committed to a routine, then you're just kind of mailing it in.
Mhm.
But I try to get there as much as I can. But you kind of touched upon this already with your epilogue thing, but I want to dig a little bit deeper in it. Being a veteran in modern America is a really strange thing. I thought about this over Memorial Day. We went to a minor league baseball game here in Tulsa, and might as well have been a 4th of July celebration. And it kind of felt like me and the old cranky guy in the Vietnam hat were the only ones who kind of got what the purpose of Memorial Day is. And there's a whole slew of reasons for why that came up. But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about your book, and I want to know what it's been like for you as a woman. As a veteran of Afghanistan with the recent withdrawal, you're a decade into this. What's it like? Do you consider it a major part of your identity? Is it a minor thing? when it comes up, do you have any kind of go-to stories or conversation tactics to deal with all these big, heavy questions that often come up, and probably come up in a different way for you than it would for me?
Well, now I can just tell people, you should read this book if you want to know what my experience was like. So that's one thing that I really struggled with when I first got back was people would, say, thank you for your service. And I know it's well-meaning, but it does feel very surface level in a lot of ways. And when people would ask about my experience or, what's it like to be in Afghanistan, what did you do over there? Like there's no short, satisfying answer, no soundbite, as I was trained in public affairs to use. That there's nothing that fits that answer in a meaningful way. And when people ask those questions, by and large, they're not prepared for the real answers, the answers that take a book to flesh out. So figuring out, where's the happy medium between, acknowledging the good intentions and also encouraging a little bit deeper level of engagement. And I certainly can't say that I've pinpointed that at this point. But in a lot of ways, I've kind of fluctuated a lot over the years. When I first left the military, about 9 months after I got back from Afghanistan, I started grad school. I moved across the country to Boston, which is like about as opposite of a small Southern military town as you can get. And I was like, I'm going to reinvent myself. Like, nobody needs to know I'm a veteran. I'm going to wear, civilian clothes. I'm going to figure out how to accessorize and put on makeup and these things that I never really did in my early 20s because I just threw on a uniform and put my hair in a bun every day. And that quickly just felt disingenuous. And of course, I was in a writing program, and the whole reason I was there was to write about my military experience. So I had to kind of reconcile that. And then I started meeting folks, like you, Matt, and the veteran writing community, and really, kind of felt like that was a great home in a lot of ways, like people who had similar experiences and we're taking a step back to be thoughtful about them and reflect on them and try to engage in those more in-depth communications. So writing is really the avenue that I have found as the best way to, find that meaningful engagement. And of course, there's a lot that, relies on individuals then picking up a piece of writing and taking the time to engage with it. And I, kind of my goal these days is to just encourage that. I certainly hope folks will read my book, but I hope folks will read Matt's books and the shorter essays and short stories out there as well.
Totally agree that the veterans writing community, even just kind of the war writing community in general, to include family members and spouses, anybody that cares about this stuff, because it often feels that a lot of people don't. It's been just such a tremendous support. Friends, readers, drinking buddies, it's hard to imagine, because life before the internet, it would have been a lot harder to find each other. I don't know what it'd been like coming home. It's a lonely journey back as a veteran, and it's certainly a lonely thing just being a writer in general. You combine those two things, finding like-minded souls is tremendously important. So yeah, I think you're very, very right on right there.
Yeah, it's also there's a weird kind of overlap in the way that both the military community and the writing community can be very intense and competitive. And somehow those of us who find ourselves in the intersection of those communities are just very supportive. And I don't feel that like intense competitive nature, which I really appreciate. So kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I am wondering, because you have such a breadth of different types of books that all focus on war, but from very different vantage points, kind of what is your strategy behind that and the motivation, and how does touching on those different genres allow you to talk about war in different ways, and kind of what inspires those different types of stories?
again, this really kind of wasn't a conscious strategy. I tend to kind of stagger through life and then figure out why I was doing something afterwards. And that's kind of been the case with my writing career as well. When I first started a blog way back when as a punk lieutenant in Iraq, trying to make sense of this crazy war we've been thrust in, I look back on it and I realized I was trying to get people to engage with it. It was this big, contentious, deservedly so, big contentious political issue, big messy issue. But it also I got there in late 2007. It also kind of seemed like people already had checked out to some extent. And I was just trying to get people to care, right? And not necessarily, it's always nice when people agree with you or agree with your conclusions, but that really wasn't my my goal. It was more just to like, this is what we're seeing and doing. Like we're out here, like feel free to check in. And I think that kind of howl into the void has been a part of everything I've ever written. Whether it's first novel, which is kind of a wider view of the Iraq War as a whole, whether it's kind of a real dark science fiction dystopian take on how endless war can corrupt a republic back home, which is what my second novel was. Whether it's a just cause popping out of seemingly nowhere, if you haven't been paying too much attention, and the kinds of weirdos and lost souls that kind of war attracts, which is what I think Daybreak is, right? And throughout all, like paying homage to the civilians who just happen to be caught up in the midst of all this, just trying to survive, who don't have a choice in it, right? For America, we have, war is so often a destination. I think it's easy for us to forget that this is something that that just because it hasn't happened in our backyard for 150 plus years, that's just geographic, luck of geographic lottery. So really, the one thing that kind of unites all these disparate views is just kind of I'm just howling, trying to get people to pay attention and to care. And there's different ways to do that. Maybe it's having a love story here in this one, having superpowers in the other one. I like doing all this as a writer, as a creator, as a craftsman, but it all starts with just kind of this I don't know, primal need to try to get people to pay attention to this stuff, because I think it really matters. Max has popped up on Dora's screen now.
I was struggling to unmute myself, not like I do this all the time. Hey, this is such a great conversation so far, and we have some really good questions from the group. And so I'm going to combine a couple questions that came together for Lauren into sort of one long question I'll ask you. And then Matt, there's a couple more questions for you. So Lauren, beyond the question of if you know whether body armor has been built for women now, and also how you ended up being commissioned, another one that Jerry Lim asked is, has it been challenging for you to translate your military role of public affairs officer into civilian speak? So can we start with that one, and then we'll move on to Matt's questions?
Yes. So I heard three questions there. And the first one, female body armor. Yes, they piloted female body armor in 2012. So, if you're doing math, that's several years after these conflicts started. So for a long time, women were wearing very poor fitting body armor. Thankfully, that has changed. How I commissioned, I went through ROTC. I got a scholarship out of high school and went through an ROTC program, and then commissioned in the Air Force when I graduated college. And sorry, I forgot the third question, which was, I think, the main thread. Oh, yes. That wonderful question. That has been a constant battle for me, because my job was to distill everything into those very digestible sound bites, and to also speak with a certain goal in mind to elicit certain reactions from whatever audience I'm communicating with. So an element of censorship, and certainly self-censorship, which came into play for me when I was in Afghanistan and got very uncomfortable being the information filter between what was happening and what the public, both the American and international publics and the Afghan public, were hearing, from my megaphone, essentially. I compensated by shutting down in a lot of ways. So turning 180 and spilling my guts into a memoir, particularly at the beginning, took a very conscious effort to not self-censor and to remind myself that it was okay to be vulnerable. And those of you who are familiar with the military probably know it's not, a place where vulnerability is really overtly encouraged. So in a lot of ways, I was kind of fighting against that culture and against my training. And in those ways, this feels like a tremendous accomplishment. This is my hollering also, Matt.
It's definitely a tremendous accomplishment. And I actually have just read it myself and I admire it so much. Okay,
Agreed.
so a
It's
couple of
excellent.
questions came out for Matt, and the first one comes from Tom Keating, who I know you're familiar with, and he's asking how much of Daybreak came from your trip to Ukraine as the war started, and because you have such great descriptions of time and place, and would you revisit Youngblood in light of the end of the war?
So when I first went over, I've been to Ukraine a couple times now, and the first time was as a volunteer, and the subsequent trip was as a journalist. It wasn't a conscious thing going over there. At the same time, I'm a writer. Like I interact with the world a certain way. The writers here, that part of your brain isn't going off at any point, right? So you're taking mental notes of. I'd never been to Ukraine before. I'd been to Eastern Europe. So I had a little familiarity with things, but it's its own country, it's its own culture. There are various cultures within Ukraine. So all that stuff. Sure, this book is absolutely informed by my time over there. At the same time, we were so busy. It was really during early in the Russian invasion. We were in Lviv, so ultimately pretty safe place, though it was missiled a few times when we were there. But we didn't know, and we were working with civilians on the real basics of self-defense, if and when the war reached them. So I wasn't thinking about this story, or the story that would become Daybreak until we got home, and I was able to kind of be a full-time writer again. But yeah, the image, that image of the church, for example, I distinctly remember that rolling in on the bus. And once I realized I was writing a novel, you best believe that I was going to put the images and the memories that stuck with me the most into the book, because that's what I do. As for Youngblood, it's interesting. So Kaboom was only about my tour during the surge with my scout platoon. And I think Youngblood was kind of functioned as what Lauren described her epilogue in the fine art of camouflage being. My Iraq, though we've since been back with the fight against ISIS, my Iraq war ended in 2011, and it really kind of stuck with me. And the story of Youngblood is set during that withdrawal, so a good 3.5 years after I was there myself. And it was my attempt through art to reconcile with not just my experiences in my war, but the war as a whole. So I think that is, it's a detective story, but it's really about a war's end and what it means for both the occupiers and the occupied.
It's wonderful. I have one more question for Matt, and if we have time, one for both of you about the way you write. So Jared Young asks, at what point did you decide or discover that Daybreak was a love story? And was that early on or as the draft evolved? And he adds a commentary, which is, the love story in war literature is a contentious issue among scholars. Do you see this novel pushing back against the criticism that sees the love story in war literature as too romantic or overly sentimental. So to break that back down, when did you discover it was a love story, and are you pushing back against this idea that a war literature love story could be too romantic or overly sentimental?
I think it was a love story from the get-go, as I started conceiving it, and it's for the simple reason that I saw young people falling in love when I was over there, seeing war is uh, not the only thing that does this to humans, but grave experiences, high moments, we get pushed to our extremes, right? Every hate, love, passion, rage, all of this is more important and feels more important in that moment. And it made sense to me that an old love that Pax had never been able to shake would be the thing that actually brings him to Ukraine, because he's a troubled man. He's very troubled. The war itself is enough to bring Lee over, his buddy, but not him. It would have to be something deeper than just the sound and the sound, the smell of bullets, and that's a woman named Svetlana that he's never been able to shake. As for, yeah, it's interesting because, like, I've written literary criticism about war literature, about Vietnam, and that stuff does interest me when I wear that hat. But when I'm an author, I really try my best not to think that way. I find my stuff gets tripped up if I start thinking about how it's going to be received too much. And for it, I wrote this story because this stuff was happening. Not necessarily this exact way, but we've all seen the images of young Ukrainian people. These people are impossibly young, 21, 22, 23, getting married very quickly. The images of fathers having to say goodbye to their children at train stations while they send their families across the border, not knowing if they're going to see them again. This stuff was happening. It was real. I saw it with my own eyes, on both trips. That's the kind of stuff that I want my writing, fiction or nonfiction, to capture. The depths of human experience, the verisimilitude of human experience, and it probably helps. The parts of early drafts of this were written in Piggott, Arkansas, on a residency where Hemingway wrote A Farewell to Arms. It's a powerful love story. Can it get too sentimental? Sure, and that's when you rely on smart readers, smart friends, to tell you that you need to rein it in. But the reality is that war does this to people, and shying away from that for the sake of literary pretentiousness, I don't know. I'd be betraying myself. I'd be betraying the work if I let that seep in too much while I'm creating, I think.
I would love to just jump in on that topic too, because I think in the women veteran writing realm, there's a similar dynamic, controversial thing coming into play, and that is conversations about sex and female sexuality in the military and in deployed environments, and that has been emerged as kind of a major theme in a lot of books that have come out in the last 10 years or so. And the reality is, like Matt said, this stuff happens, and shying away from it and not including it is not capturing the full genuine human experience. And that's I see in Matt's work and in so much of the other post 9/11 veteran writing and military writing as a whole, is that it really trying to hone in on the humanity of the experience, not so much the zoomed out big war picture that we see on the news, and that becomes such a charged political thing, but the humans involved, and those humans are young adults who are having these extreme emotions and connections to one another, and doing things that young adults do. So let's make sure we're capturing the full package there.
Well said.
So well said. And in fact, that is the perfect note for us to actually end on tonight. The hour just
Sex.
flew, boy, it flew by. What a pleasure it has been to talk with you both about your books and to hear your ideas about war literature and how it's so much more than what it can be encapsulated in when the critics think of war literature. Thank you for being with us tonight.
If I could just give a quick plug. So the link that was shared in the chat to buy my book, that is through my local bookstore here in Olympia, Washington. And they are offering signed and personalized copies. So if you would like one of those, use that link to get it, and just note in the comments as you're checking out what you would like me to say, and I will run down there and sign it for you. They offer free shipping for orders over $50, so you should probably pick up a couple of Matt's books while you're there as well.
That was great.
I already have them.
Get a copy to use as a gift. Books make great
Okay.
gifts.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Congratulations, Lauren. It's really
Yes.
a tremendous book. Max and Birchbark, thanks so much for having us. This was a real treat.
We really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone for
everyone.
coming.
Yep, thanks. Good night.
Be
Thanks,
well.
Max.